Hello, this time we're going to look at a segment of our recent Jubilee debate with Alex O'Connor. I enjoy listening to him because he has a rare ability to have a logical conversation without having any emotion involved. So, part of the point of this video is to learn how to think and learn how to have a civil discussion. But before we start, please like this video and subscribe to my channel.
Hi, my name's Alex O'Connor. I'm an atheist and host of the Within Reason podcast, and today I'm surrounded by 25 Christians who, God willing, might be able to change my mind. My first claim is that suffering makes God's existence unlikely.
The first claim is suffering makes God's existence unlikely. What I have to say is that this is such a carefully crafted prompt because in the word unlikely, you leave the possibility of interpretation. But before diving into this claim, I want to give you some general arguments, the background about the major points regarding this claim. The original topic is Theodicy, which is the problem of evil, and this is a variant of it. If God is defined as all-powerful, all-knowing, and perfectly good, then if God can prevent suffering but chooses not to, it challenges God's goodness. And if God cannot prevent it, it challenges God's power. And these sufferings are most of the time unfairly imposed, gratuitous, and unnecessary, and occur at a great magnitude such that they do not seem to serve any greater purpose. So, to counter this point, there have been arguments such as free will and soul-making theodicy. So these arguments are made to counter the original claim and argue that suffering is necessary for growth and further greater good. Another thing to notice here is that a more popular version of this prompt is called the problem of evil because moral issues are limited to humans. So Alex chose an alternative way to argue the problem of suffering because then you can expand the targets to sentient beings, including animals. Then this prompt is dealing with, for example, why should an earthquake occur sort of question. And I think this is something most of debaters weren't really familiar with throughout the video. Also, I think it's a really hard topic. If you pick up Theodicy and argue that those events make you grow, then as you see in the later part of the debate, it's similar to you suffering from cancer so that chemotherapy can be developed. But why would you need to impose the suffering of cancer in the first place? So that would be the type of question. If you want to do your own research, you can search up Theodicy.
Good work.
Hey Alex, how's it going?
How's it going? Nice to meet you.
Sage. Why don't you just begin? Why does suffering or evil make God's existence unlikely?
I think when confronted with two hypotheses, so atheism, naturalism, or theism, we should ask what we expect would occur under either hypothesis.
First, he lays out two options, atheism and theism, and because the law of excluded middle, it closes the secret door. This is a very interesting approach compared to directly defining each term in the prompt and connecting them. I found it a paraphrasing of the original claim saying, hey, it's either likely or unlikely.
And then we look at the world and we see what does actually occur. And what do we find? We find, I think most relevant here, a system of natural selection, the mechanism by which God apparently chose to bring animals and ultimately human beings into existence. A system which is defined by suffering. Survival of the fittest is the same thing as the death and suffering and destruction of the unfit. I'm told that the very mechanism that God chose to bring about the human species as the ultimate end of his creation was one that is imbued with suffering, such that 99.9% of all the species, let alone animals, that have ever existed on planet Earth have been brutally wiped from existence into extinction. And I think that that's less likely on theism. If you assume atheism or materialism, not only do you explain this, you also come to expect it.
And he argues that the process by which we characterize the world is natural selection, which entails enormous suffering. So this argument is sort of interpolation between the problem of evil and the Darwinian evolutionary perspective. So here, suppose we accept the implication, which is we have to come to existence through evolution. Even if you argue that this process has occurred because of God, you now have to deal with its value proposition. That is, the suffering that makes the evolutionary process entails through the survival of the fittest would be unnecessary if God existed. So This might sound like a nested argument, but this is very straightforward.
What is your, I guess, epistemology? How do you know that this is the case, that it's less likely, and that, an atheist worldview, a naturalistic worldview would look like the way it is today?
Of course, we don't know, but that's why I use the phraseology of unlikely. I think that if you were to tell somebody who was sort of in some Rawlsian state of nature, hadn't seen the world, and you said that the world has been created by an omnibenevolent, all-powerful God, what kind of world would that person be imagining? And if you dropped them into the world, if you were given the opportunity to become a wild animal, like in 2 seconds, I was just going to turn you into a random wild animal somewhere on planet Earth.
I like being a guy.
I think you'd probably kill yourself before I had the opportunity,
Okay.
because you know that the life of these animals is almost defined in terms of their suffering.
Then the question goes, hey, are you sure that this would have made perfect sense without the existence of God? And the answer was, hey, I don't know, so I claim unlikely here. But if you imagine the purest and the most benevolent state of nature, as Jean-Jacques Rousseau said, then you would be so overwhelmed by the predictable suffering in your life that you would take away your own life.
I guess I just don't really see how you can justify that claim per se. What I would say is that if we actually take into account the holistic view of the scriptures, which I do think that you have to do, we see that it's actually much more coherent once you acknowledge that evil itself doesn't have ontology. Evil's not a thing. You don't look under a rock and say, there's the evil, right?
Fine by
And
me.
so
I'm not really talking about evil here, because that's, of course, a moral term. I'm talking about suffering.
can you distinctualize suffering and evil?
So evil is a moral term. Evil means that something is bad, it's immoral. You need to have a moral ontology for that. Suffering is just any experience that's not wanted when experienced, right? And so even if you don't have a moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists. So here's a question. A deer gets its leg caught under the branch of a tree that's fallen over in the wild, and it starves to death in confused agony. Why does God oversee this? And why does God set the natural world up such that events like this occur?
Well, because the ultimate view here is that
Okay, pause.
The sage says, hey, the Bible has been very coherent about evil, and evil is not a tangible existence. But they're talking about suffering, not evil. And I think this might sound confusing, but evil is a matter of good and bad. It's a moral issue. But life can be painful and hard, and just because it's hard and painful, it does not carry moral implications. For example, we don't call natural disasters evil. The next sentence is very important. So even if you don't have moral objectivism, you can still say that suffering exists, because the subtle attempt, if you notice, was, hey, evil does not have tangible existence, so it's subject to human interpretation or categorization, which is a really, really subtle attempt to provide the basis for the counter-argument. Hey, therefore, life is full of evil/suffering, but it can be construed as good. But I want to tell you that even with that attitude, you cannot just get rid of the existence of suffering, because it's not subject to morality.
How's it going? Nice to meet you too.
Okay, so my first question to start out with is, what exactly about suffering makes this unlikely on the condition that God exists?
I think that if God is all loving, then he probably wouldn't want his creatures to suffer. And so I think that the fact that they do suffer makes his existence less likely.
So you saw the paraphrasing of the original argument that I displayed to you. So Tim comes in and wants to start from scratch. The point is like, hey, life is too painful. Why would it be this painful if God was all loving, right?
Okay, perfect. And is there some specific aspect of suffering that you're particularly honing in on,
Yeah.
horrendous or
In
whatever that is?
particular, non-human animal suffering. Because I think that the Christianity has a celebrated tradition of Theodicies trying to explain why suffering exists.
Yeah.
Human free will, the development of the soul, higher order goods, all of this kind of stuff. None of which apply to the suffering of non-human animals.
Now he brings up animal theodicy, because for humans, theologians have argued that suffering serves a greater purpose, a betterment of being, for example. Usually this is a blind spot, because suffering is built into sentient beings, but in most religious terms, animals are not subject to value judgment. So it's very difficult to expand the previous arguments about theodicy.
Have you heard of the axiological expectation mismatch problem?
I have not.
Okay, so philosophers of religion have started to understand that the thing that actually generates a problem between God and suffering is actually the value system you attach to the very attribute of perfect lovingness. Because the problem of evil is an internal critique, you have to look at a very specific version of theism and how it defines perfect lovingness. I want to present to you a version where my version of perfect lovingness does not actually constitute a problem and a misalignment, that mismatch between the suffering of animals, let's just say the profusion of suffering of animals and the existence of God.
So let's hear it. What kind of God are we imagining that would allow and oversee and do nothing to prevent billions of years of untold animal suffering?
Right, so you're talking about non-prevention.
Or setting up the system that is natural selection such that that it relies upon things like predation and disease.
Well, the first part is I don't agree with the whole setting up the system part. So I'm not one of those theists that believes that God does this select and pick idea of creating worlds. I don't think that God actually creates worlds. I think that God lets worlds develop according in a certain way, but because God can oversee an overarching narrative, he knows exactly how he can redeem anything that goes. The first time, sorry, go ahead.
So here, a very difficult term is brought up, axiological expectation mismatch problem. And he argues, no, the reason you have these problems is because you have certain expectations, such as perfect lovingness that you define in your own term. So what kind of God would this be? And he says, hey, God lets the world develop, which is a very paraphrasing of, hey, God intentionally did not intervene and did not prevent the suffering.
Could God have made it such that animals were all herbivores instead of carnivores and omnivores?
Yes, he could totally do that.
Okay, so had he done that, here's an instant way to reduce by orders of magnitude the amount of suffering that exists.
Right, but hold on. That's particularly assuming a value theory already that I haven't told you I'm adopting that has a problem with the evil. So I have to give you my value theory first for you to show that misalignment.
Okay, let's hear it.
Perfect. Okay, so my value theory says that it's not the most important thing about a sentient creature is not what merely happens to them. It's about the total timeline of their life and how and where their life permanently ends. Meaning, if you were to judge an author of a narrative and the first few chapters, let's say, there's a lot of bad things happening, but the end ends with this crescendo where there's victoriousness, there's redemption, there's beauty, and everyone in the story actually endorses their entire existence that they live. They can look at their they can look at their total timeline, and they actually each subjectively come to the conclusion, I'm glad I was made, and I totally see what my suffering was for. That's the particular I'm using with. So we have to judge, like John Hicks says, we have to judge the very nature of God's lovingness by what he does in the end, not these few time slices that we observe right now. For you to show that there's a problem, you have to show to me that the suffering of animals cannot be transformed, are intrinsically cut off from being transformed into a life that they will endorse. There's a couple of theses on the table, but sure, go ahead.
I think it was a really interesting part of the conversation. So Alex says, hey, for example, if animals did not eat each other, then would it be better for them? And Tim says, hey, hold on, but I'm saying for animals, what matters is not instantaneous events, but the accumulation of those experiences and where they end up permanently. What he means here is that, hey, the painful evolutionary process or the entire history of sentient beings was a necessary condition for us humans to flourish. So animal suffering has meaning. And I really want to say, I really love the subtleness of arguments in this debate and how each of the participants catches it really, really well.
So are you talking about the end of their life is in their end of life on Earth, or are you talking about the afterlife?
I'm antemortem, postmortem.
Because if you're just talking about life on Earth, then I would say that if you had an author writing a book and a character, if we were trying to figure out the relationship between that author and the person in the book, and that person in the book shows up for 5 seconds in the first chapter and is a child who almost immediately dies of cancer in an incredibly painful way, and there's no development, there's no sort of bringing back to life and suddenly everyone's grateful for it. It is just this miserable, tragic experience. And I asked, well, what did the author not want to do for the story of the book, but want to do for that character?
Yes.
I think it would be pretty damning. And also, when it comes to animals, we're talking about animals who are predated on from the moment that they begin existence.
Absolutely.
They sort of have disease. Zebras, when they're killed by lions, are often too big to be killed instantly, so they die over minutes with their windpipes caught in the jaws of a lion. Sure. How can this be developing a zebra, which, by the way, probably doesn't even have the same kind of first-person conscious experience that humans do in order to sort of rationalize and abstract and learn from their sort of past and morally develop in that way? They just suffer. And what kind of God could oversee this?
Okay, so there's a lot of assumptions on the table again. Again, you're assuming a particular value system that I'm not laying
I'll tell you what
out.
I'm assuming here. What I'm assuming here is that a good God would not allow unnecessary suffering to obtain.
Okay, gotcha. So we can
Do
talk.
you agree with that?
We can talk about unnecessary suffering. We're talking about the justifying norms for suffering. You're saying it has to be in terms of necessity, which is an evil is only authorizable by God if it's in connection to a greater good or prevention of a greater evil. Correct?
If there's some kind of justification for allowing that
Yeah,
suffering.
but you're saying it's a necessary connection. Why you say? What's the term of necessity?
So,
doing here?
so perhaps I should say unjustified instead of unnecessary.
Okay, so we both agree. I do not believe that God can authorize
Okay, so
justified,
tell me
unjustified suffering.
Tell me how that example that I gave you, the deer with its leg
Right.
starving, is justified.
Because it's intrinsically redeemable, and the norms I'm working with is not this necessity condition that you're working with. Mine is about redeemable suffering, redeemability, or what we call
For the deer?
defeasibility. If that suffering can be defeated within the creature's life, and I'll define what I mean by defeat, which is that they can retroactively look back at what they went through and integrate it into their life history, where they look at their
Hold on,
life.
I have to interrupt because the example I gave you is one where the deer dies.
Yes, the deer dies. But here's the thing. You're probably talking about this post-mortem example. Sure. I'm going to put one thesis on the table. There's two philosophers that defend exactly what this goes through. One defends that animals will be given a martyrdom status, while God will be able to present himself in a way to animals in the afterlife, such that in the same way you could give praise to a dog, and the dog emotionally recognizes that he's loved and that his life is worth living, right? To these animals that suffered like that, there's one view on the table, which is that God will give them a praiseworthy status where they will be able to actually
Sure.
see that.
Can we talk about that claim? Because
So they talked to each other for a bit, and the counter-argument presented by Alex O'Connor was, hey, those conclusions cannot directly justify the suffering of individual creatures. These sufferings are unnecessary, and a good God wouldn't allow them. And Tim says, hey, don't assume this version of God who scoops the cake and feeds it in your mouth. He points out, he used the word justifiability to diagnose a term better instead of necessity. So even if the deer dies, there are people who say the deer will be given a martyrdom status and God will reward the deer for what it deserves.
these animals are suffering for what? I mean, God might cause them to suffer
It's
a
not
bunch.
means to ends. This is not means to ends.
God might cause them to suffer a bunch and then essentially redeem them in the afterlife. But what for? Like, why do this? If I were to punch you in the face and then give you $20,000 afterwards, you might be grateful for the $20,000.
Yeah.
But why couldn't I just give you the $20,000?
Well, see, so that's assuming. So I saw your debate with Trent.
You've been voted out
All right.
by the majority.
Awesome,
Please
man.
return to your seat.
So the last point was about if you want to give a reward, why let them suffer in the first place? And I think this was a really good conversation, and I don't know if I have to argue from his perspective. I might say because the evolutionary process is what God has determined for us, but then I feel like this question will come up again, like why was it the only option, right?
Would you say that theism or atheism better account for the idea that suffering exists and a purpose for it?
Depends exactly what you mean, because of course you might say that the world itself is more expected on theism, and since suffering, needs the existence of the world, that it's theism. But granted the existence of a material world, let's say, I think atheism.
Okay, why does suffering exist at all? Like in an atheistic worldview, what is the cause of suffering?
Oh, well, because however life began, it developed through a series of natural selection, which requires animals to develop senses that they wish to avoid in order to be more likely to survive. And that's why pain receptors evolve. In a world where not all of these pains are actually going to kill us, we're left with situations in which we're in a lot of pain but don't end up dying for it.
Would you agree that consciousness is necessary for suffering?
I would say probably, yeah.
Does atheism account for consciousness?
Yes, that's what I was talking about a moment ago. Perhaps not. Maybe theism accounts better for consciousness than atheism does.
So if there is no consciousness, there is no suffering. Is that right?
That's probably true, yeah.
So if atheism cannot account for consciousness, then it cannot account for suffering. Would you
Yeah.
agree?
Hayden's argument is, hey, you have to have consciousness to feel suffering, but in the atheist viewpoint, you're not very successful in explaining our consciousness. So that's what it is.
Agree with that?
So I think what we're doing here is we're sort of slightly shifting the goalposts. If you don't want to grant the existence of the material world before we start talking about this, we can do an argument from consciousness. But then we need to debate whether consciousness is explicable on atheism. What I'm going to say is this.
Sure.
What I'm going to say is this. Consciousness may seem to imply the existence of a conscious creator of the universe. We're here talking about, I suppose we're talking about Christianity, and the claim was about God. But the God that you believe in, let's say, if we grant that there is a creator deity who sort of brings about the universe of conscious creatures, have you ever heard of the evil God hypothesis that Stephen Law popularized or came
No,
up with?
tell me it.
So the idea is that, imagine that there's a God who brings about the world and creates the world, but does it maliciously because he wants human beings to suffer. He brings about a world in order so that human beings will suffer. Right? That seems like a plausible hypothesis.
Then the defense comes in and Alex counter-argues that, hey, that is a separate argument, and consciousness may imply the existence of a conscious creator, and it seems that you don't accept that atheism can explain consciousness, but it is explicable. And Alex steps further and argues, hey, traditionally, theologians have attempted to reconcile the existence of evil with the goodness of God. But if that's possible, then here is a hypothesis that says you should be able to reconcile the existence of good with the evilness of God equally.
And even if you think that consciousness points towards God, the kind of God that a lot of Christians think is a sort of necessary quality of God, which is to be all-loving, might not have to apply here.
Can I ask a question?
Yes.
If Christianity were true, is it plausible that suffering is necessary for God's purpose, for
if
his
Christianity
creation?
is true, then I think it must be necessary because there'd be no other explanation.
Okay, so we're
for it.
not talking about whether or not Christianity is true.
But if you're asking me if it's plausible that Christianity is true and therefore suffering is necessary, I would say probably not, because I don't
Okay.
think suffering should be necessary or could be necessary.
In an atheistic worldview, I would agree with you. It makes no sense at all. But okay, I would ask this question.
So can I ask you
Sure.
why then, if God exists and wants to come to know everybody and wants to love everybody and does so for the sake of human beings, why he chose to imbue the world with so much suffering that is at least seemingly completely inexplicable?
And then Hayden goes and Alex responds, if Christianity is true, then the suffering has to serve a purpose or be necessary. And it goes, hey, let's go to this question. As a Christian, why do you think God created the world that is full of suffering?
Are you a father?
No.
I'm a father. I want my son to become just like I am, better than I am, I should say. I want him to become the best that he can be. Is it possible for him to reach his potential without suffering in his life?
Perhaps not, but there's
Okay, so suffering is necessary.
There are a few things I want to say
Okay.
here. Firstly, that kind of moral development doesn't apply to non-human animals, as I've already said. Right? That does not account
Why not?
that does not account for the brutal death of animals in the wild. Also, if I don't want to talk about your son because it's tragic to think about, but somebody else's son
Sure.
has suffered and died immediately as a
Sure.
result of that suffering, they don't get to develop in the same way.
At this moment, Alex was so emotionless. It's almost astonishing. Hayden says, to reach your full potential, you need suffering. And Alex says, hey, animals cannot go through the same developmental process. And if someone else, if they die immediately, they don't get to develop in the way you mentioned.
I would agree that on a micro level, it's very hard to justify. And we can ask the question, why doesn't God intervene on all
So
of
look,
these
you might be able to
sufferings?
justify an amount of suffering,
Yeah.
right? But the fact that there's so much gratuitous suffering in the world is what I think makes God's existence unlikely. There are some instances where maybe a certain amount of suffering brings about a certain amount of good in a situation. That, by the way, would count as a justification. But when a child dies of leukemia and they're dead,
Could there be a purpose to it? What if the
There-
death of the child brings their parents to God?
then
to
perhaps
salvation?
then the parents should be grateful that their child got leukemia because it's doing the will
No,
of the Lord.
not necessarily.
That seems
All
right,
obscene
pause.
to me.
No. You're
Please
awesome.
return to your
Thanks,
seat.
You're so cool.
And Alex argues that, hey, there is an enormous amount of gratuitous / unnecessary suffering, and it cannot be explained through a handful of sacrifice / reward frameworks.
I would love to pull back a little bit.
Sure.
And ask you, what are your values kind of rooted in and grounded in? Where would we start with that?
So I'm an ethical emotivist, which is a form of ethical non-cognitivism. I don't think that ethical claims have truth value. I think they're expressions of emotion.
If we're pulling back a little bit, I remember reading at the end of Richard Dawkins' book, The God Delusion, that we can't trust our senses because evolution doesn't really care about making truth claims. It
I
cares
think
about
that's right.
surviving.
I don't know.
Do you agree with that?
I don't think Dawkins actually endorsed that argument, but it's a good argument. C.S. Lewis, Alvin Plantinga, the argument from reason, sure.
But would you agree or disagree with that?
Well, I mean, I remain agnostic on what reason is, but I think it's a powerful argument.
When it comes to determining if suffering is wrong or right,
This time, the argument that makes me really, really excited came out. Alvin Plantinga's evolutionary argument against naturalism. It says, even if you have wrong beliefs, if it's beneficial to your survivability, then the natural selection would favor the wrong belief, wrong reasoning, or hallucinations over pure rational ability. If you think about the natural selection process, it only matters if you survive or your genes survive, not how smart you are or how much power you have. So I have some really smart friends, and when they have some really creative achievements, we celebrate it. And I make jokes sometimes like, oh, now you have proof that you're the smartest, but nature selects for survivability, you know that, so make sure you get 12 kids like Elon Musk, and I hope I'm not a bad friend.
So, okay, so crucially, I'm not saying that suffering is morally wrong. Outside of the senses that I, as an emotivist, will just express an emotion towards it, that I don't like it. I'm not claiming that it's immoral, that it's objectively bad. What I'm claiming is that suffering is unexpected on theism. It's an internal critique, right? Lincoln said of slavery, if this is not wrong, then nothing is wrong. You don't have to believe that something's wrong, but if there is such a thing as objective morality, I don't think that it would consist in a God who oversees the amount of suffering that we have on planet Earth.
Timothy Keller does this story about no-see-ums. Have you heard of the no-see-um story?
No.
Yeah, so he says if you have a tent and you look in there and you say, hey, I think I have some dogs in the tent. Maybe, like, for example, I have a golden doodle. He's a killer. That was just a joke, but we can move on. And if I said, hey, I have a golden doodle inside the tent, you would expect to see one. But if I said, hey, there's some no-see-ums, these little gnats are so tiny they actually go through the screen.
Sure.
He says, there's some no-see-ums in the tent. You might look in there and go, I don't see any no-see-ums. But of course you don't see no-see-ums because nobody can see them.
Okay, so
Just because there's maybe not a reason that we can identify doesn't mean that there can't be a reason. Now, it's kind of cold comfort. That doesn't get us 100% of the way there, but it gets us part of the way there.
that's true. So the existence of evil is not logically, or suffering is not logically incompatible with God's existence. But it's a bit like if somebody came up to me right now and stole my friend's wallet in front of me and shot him dead and ran away, and I was grieving, and somebody said to me, well, hey man, you don't know, that person might have worked for the CIA, and your friend might have secretly been harboring the nuclear codes, and killing him might have been good for the country, and he stole the wallet because that's where the codes were. And I would say, well, what evidence do you have for that? And you say, well, look, just because I don't have evidence for it doesn't mean that there might not be some evidence that I don't know about.
And Alex says, hey, I'm not saying suffering is objectively bad, but I'm saying suffering is unexpected and it's an internal critique. And I think this argument is also important, saying, hey, just because we can't identify the reason doesn't mean it can be rationalized. But what Alex says here is, hey, you have the burden of proof because suffering precedes the rationalization.
I would say, until I see why I should think that's the case, I'm not going to believe it. And I'm certainly not going to be less upset in my grieving over my friend because of the possibility that there could be an explanation for it. There's so much suffering imbued in the human experience that if somebody says, well, look, there could be an explanation, it's like, okay, fine, but let me know when you know what it is.
Oh, great. I think the thing that's hard...
Pause. You've been voted out by the majority. Please return to your seats.
Sorry, Dan, more time.
Hey,
Thanks,
all right,
Austin.
thank you.
Good fun. Hey, nice to meet you. How are you?
Good. Repeat your claim one more time.
That suffering is unexpected if a good God exists.
Unexpected. So when you say unexpected, like you're caught off guard by it, or you're expecting like all good things to happen over
That
time?
if I assume that there is a good God supervising, invigilating the universe, that I would not expect to see so much suffering.
Right.
So
And
much gratuitous, seemingly unnecessary suffering.
Now you see that the argument is a lot more polished. Suffering is unexpected if a good God existed. Throughout the debate, the prompt goes into a metamorphosis and changes wording a bit, and he mentioned that suffering is gratuitous.
Right. And you know, the most beautiful thing is that our God is not unfamiliar with suffering as he suffered himself. So would you say that there is like some beauty in suffering in some way?
I would say that there can be sort of poetically, you can look at suffering and think that's a beautiful story, but I don't think that the person suffering, especially if they die as a direct result, might think that. Also, I think that if I knew someone whose child died of leukemia and suffered for it,
Right.
and I went to them and said, but hey, there's some beauty in the suffering, isn't there? I think I'd be
Right.
kicked out of the funeral.
Also, this is a really interesting point to have a thought experiments, because we've been doing all sorts of theoretical arguments on this and that and argue based on them, but also if you apply the hypothesis to a hypothetical situation that could happen in our life, then our common sense, not our rationale, can give a direct sense of what our conclusion entails. And if you're familiar with Alex O'Connor, you probably heard of him talking about this metaphor of calculator. So you talk about all the logic through rationale, like using a calculator, but the real life situations are what you feel like. So sometimes they match and sometimes they don't match. And sometimes if our calculator tells us something that we don't like, then we just throw away the calculator. But this time it matched. So that's why it's really, really interesting.
Right. Well, I would say like the same thing for a woman giving birth, right? It's suffering, like it sucks, it hurts.
Sure. But imagine you could have the giving birth without the pain of giving birth.
Right.
Would you prefer that?
of course, yeah, you would prefer that.
So then if God can bring about the good stuff without the bad stuff,
Right.
then there's no reason to bring about the bad stuff.
Right.
So what we have to show is why the bad stuff is necessary to bring about the good stuff. Otherwise, it's not justified.
Right. Well, could you say that the result of why we suffer is because of fall of man?
I would say not, because I don't believe in the fall of
Right,
man.
true.
But I also don't think that that explains non-human animal suffering. The big thing that I want to keep pressing is that the theodicies that we talk about, free will, fall of man, all of this kind of stuff,
Right.
I don't think applies to that deer with its leg caught under the branch that's dying in confused agony. What's this for?
So what is it about animals that seems so like more important than a human?
It's not that they're more
suffering?
important. It's that, as you say, like it seems plausible at least that a human can suffer and then be sort of better off for it, or that they can enjoy poetry of suffering, the
Right.
poetry of suffering. Animals can't do that.
Right.
Animals can't enjoy the poetry of suffering.
Well, I mean, I wouldn't know. I never like talked to an animal and said like, hey, like,
I have. They just haven't. They just haven't talked back. Is the problem?
So this is also very interesting. Pain is involved, but if it's not painful, people generally prefer the painless option over a painful one. Very similar to utility maximization. Also, the free will type of arguments that have a longer history cannot be applied to animal theodicy. So this is really tricky, and I understand her response. Then why does it matter so much? Weren't our problems the original theodicy about humans?
But I just don't see why we would expect that God would oversee this system of
Right.
natural selection.
Right, but
Billions of animals suffering and dying, predation, disease, eating
Right.
each other alive, leaving each
Right.
other to bleed out on the
Right.
floor. And this is being supervised by an all-loving God?
well, do you think that's God's intention from the very beginning of creation of all things?
I think that God oversees the mechanism. God could have made it, for example,
Right.
one example that I've already given is that God could have made animals herbivores, which just eliminates the problem of predation.
I mean, there are some animals that are.
There are, but he could have made more of them. He could have made all animals herbivores, thereby eliminating the suffering of predation.
So is the issue of
Predation
them eating each other?
That's one issue. That's one way that God could have sort of, I think, quite trivially reduced the amount of suffering. David Attenborough once said of his documentaries, people who complain that we put too much violence in the documentaries should see what we leave in the cutting room floor. The animal world is just filled with unimaginable suffering. Just predation is
But there's also cute
unimaginable.
things about like, you know, otters holding hands so they
That's
don't
true.
swim away.
But
All
could
right,
you have that
guys,
without the
pause,
suffering?
pause,
That's the
pause.
question. Thanks so much.
Thank you.
Good fun.
Anyways, I really enjoyed this debate. I think I learned a lot from this. And if I get more time, I would love to work on the rest of this Jubilee video. Anyways, I hope you really like this video. And if you have any opinions or ideas, please share them in the comment section. And don't forget to subscribe to my channel. See you next time. Bye bye.